All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into some pretty intense stuff.
Yeah.
We're talking about the possibility of a peace deal in the Ukraine-Russia conflict and what that could mean for, global security, the whole nine yards.
Right.
And we've got this article here from Saki22.txt.
Okay.
And honestly, some of this stuff in here is raising some serious questions. Like, is the U.S. taking a step back from its commitment to NATO?
Right.
What even is a U.S. backstop? What does that even mean in practice?
Yeah.
And could it mean we actually see U.K. troops, boots on the ground in Ukraine?
Wow.
And then on top of that, we've got this whole mix of opinions from European leaders that we really need to kind of unpack and try to make sense of.
Absolutely.
So by the end of this, you'll have a much clearer picture, I think, of all the different forces at play here and what's really at stake in these potential negotiations.
Yeah, it's a really complex situation.
Yeah.
I think what's striking right off the bat is that, the U.S. seems to be kind of leading the charge on these peace talks with Russia.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of concern, especially from European leaders, that they're being left out of the loop. And the fact that Ukraine itself is being excluded from these initial discussions is definitely raising some eyebrows.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely feels like a power play by the U.S. a little bit, right?
It does.
But the article also suggests that this move might actually be a way to force Europe into taking more responsibility for its own security. It's almost like the U.S. is saying, hey, you guys need to step up.
Right, exactly.
What do you make of that?
Well, it is a fascinating dynamic, isn't it?
Yeah.
It seems like some U.S. officials are poking this narrative that Europe needs to invest more in its own defense and become less reliant on U.S. military might.
Yeah.
And we see this reflected in the article with U.K. Prime Minister Keir Starmer's insistence on a U.S. backstop as a condition for any peace deal.
Okay, so let's break down this whole backstop idea, because it's clearly a major point of contention here.
It is.
The article's a little vague on the specifics, but it seems like it could involve everything from air support and intelligence sharing to actually deploying troops to Ukraine as part of a multinational peacekeeping force.
Right.
And that's where things get really tricky, right?
Exactly. I mean, the term backstop is deliberately ambiguous.
Yeah.
It allows for a range of interpretations. And that's probably why it's causing so much anxiety among European leaders.
Yeah.
Some see it as a potential security guarantee from the U.S.,
right,
while others view it as a way for the U.S. to kind of reduce its own involvement while pushing Europe to the front lines.
Right. And let's not forget, the logistical nightmare of deploying and maintaining a multinational force in Ukraine.
Oh, yeah.
Especially if the goal is to, actually deter further Russian aggression. The article quotes Malcolm Chalmers from the Royal United Services Institute.
Okay.
And he doesn't sugarcoat the challenges.
Right.
He points out the sheer scale of the operation.
Yeah.
We're talking potentially hundreds of thousands of troops, air support equipment, the whole 9 yards.
Wow.
And the massive financial burden that comes with all of that.
Yeah, Chalmers' point raises an interesting question, though.
What's that?
Is this hesitancy about the logistical challenges actually a way for certain countries to signal their reluctance to commit troops without significant U.S. involvement?
Oh, that's interesting.
It's possible they're using these practical concerns as a way to kind of push back against the idea of a European-led peacekeeping force.
That's a great point. It's almost like a coded message, right?
Exactly.
We're not saying no, but have you considered how hard this would be?
Right, right.
And then you have figures like General Sir Adrian Bradshaw, who was a former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of NATO,
right,
who seemed much more open to the idea of a substantial troop presence.
Yes, and it's worth noting Bradshaw's background here.
Yeah.
As someone who has been deeply involved in NATO operations, he likely has a different perspective on the feasibility and strategic value of such a deployment.
Right.
For him, it's not just about the logistics, it's about sending a clear message of deterrence to Russia.
But even if Europe could muster the political will and the resources for this massive troop deployment, is it realistic to expect them to match U.S. military capabilities in the short term?
That's a good question.
The article highlights the significant increase in defense spending that would be required across the board.
Right.
And that's a tough sell, I think, for a lot of European countries that are facing economic challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see this tension playing out in the differing opinions of European leaders.
Yeah.
Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen seems aligned with Starmer's call for increased defense spending.
Okay.
But then you have German Chancellor Olaf Scholz expressing reservations, suggesting that any talk of sending troops is premature.
And then you have Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk.
Right.
whose country is right on the front lines,
Yeah.
supporting Ukraine with aid, but seeming to draw a line when it comes to committing troops. So clearly there's no unified European stance on this.
No.
It's more like a spectrum of viewpoints with a lot of factors at play.
Right.
National interests, domestic politics, and of course, like the very real fear of provoking further Russian aggression.
And you have to wonder, is this lack of consensus is emboldening Russia?
Oh, interesting.
You know, they're seeing this debate unfold. It's uncertainty among Western allies.
Right.
And it might make them less willing to make concessions in any peace negotiations.
Okay, so we've got the U.S. pushing for peace, but maybe not wanting to fully disengage Europe, grappling with its own security anxieties. And Russia likely watching all of this with a very calculating eye.
Exactly.
And let's not forget, the fighting in Ukraine is still going on.
Right.
With tragic loss of life happening every day.
Yeah.
The human cost of this conflict keeps rising even as all these diplomatic maneuvers are taking place.
It's a terrible situation.
It's a stark reminder that this isn't just like a theoretical debate. It's a real-world conflict with devastating consequences.
Absolutely.
But before we get into the potential peace deal concessions and the long-term implications of all of this, I think we need to dig a little deeper into what this U.S. backstop might actually look like in practice.
I agree.
What are the specifics beyond just vague assurances of support?
Right.
We'll unpack that in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good.
So we've established that this whole U.S. backstop thing is kind of a vague concept, right?
It is a little bit.
Like, what could this support actually look like on the ground? The article touches on a few possibilities, but I'm curious to hear your take on what the specifics might be.
Well, it's important to remember that a backstop doesn't necessarily mean like boots on the ground.
Okay.
It could involve a whole range of measures designed to like bolster Ukraine's defenses and deter further Russian aggression.
Right.
And without direct military intervention.
So more like a layered approach.
Exactly, yeah, like a layered approach.
So what kind of layers are you talking about here?
Well, one layer could be intelligence sharing.
Okay.
The U.S. has incredibly sophisticated surveillance capabilities.
Right.
And they could provide Ukraine with, you know, real-time intelligence on Russian troop movements, potential attack plans, that sort of thing.
Okay.
This would give Ukraine a crucial advantage in anticipating and responding to any future threats.
That makes sense. It's almost like giving them an early warning system.
Exactly.
But wouldn't Russia see that as a provocation, though?
Potentially, but the U.S. could argue that it's simply helping Ukraine defend its sovereign territory.
Right.
And remember, this intelligence sharing could be done discreetly, without any public pronouncements or anything.
Okay, so it's more about behind-the-scenes support.
Right.
What other layers are we looking at?
Another layer could be providing advanced military hardware to Ukraine. Things like anti-tank missiles, air defense systems, maybe even drones. This wouldn't necessarily involve deploying U.S. troops,
right,
but it would significantly enhance Ukraine's ability to defend itself.
So equipping them to fight their own battles, but not actually fighting for them?
Exactly.
Got it.
And then there's the financial aspect.
Okay.
The U.S. could guarantee substantial financial aid for Ukraine's reconstruction efforts,
right,
which would send a strong signal of long-term commitment and help stabilize the country after the conflict ends.
That's a good point.
This would also alleviate some of the financial burden on European allies.
Interesting. So instead of sending troops, the U.S. could essentially bankroll the recovery effort?
Exactly.
Which could be pretty appealing to some European leaders who are hesitant to commit their own resources.
Right, and this financial aid could be tied to specific reforms and anti-corruption measures, ensuring that the money is used effectively and transparently.
So we've got intelligence, weapons, money. Are there any other potential layers to this backstop?
One more that's worth considering is the deployment of a limited number of U.S. troops to neighboring NATO countries, like Poland or the Baltic states. This wouldn't be a direct intervention in Ukraine, but it would demonstrate a visible U.S. commitment to the region's security and serve as a deterrent against any Russian expansion ambitions.
So it's more about projecting strength and reassurance than actually engaging in combat.
Precisely. It's a way of saying, we're here, we're watching, and we're ready to act if necessary. And that message would be directed not only at Russia, but also at European allies, reassuring them of continued U.S. support.
It's a delicate balancing act, isn't it?
It is.
Trying to provide enough support to deter Russia without escalating the conflict or provoking a wider war.
Exactly.
And speaking of provoking Russia, let's talk about another crucial aspect of this potential peace deal, the concessions. What are the sticking points here?
Well, one of the biggest sticking points is likely to be the issue of territorial integrity.
Okay.
Russia has already annexed Crimea
Right.
and controls significant portions of eastern Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
and it's unlikely they'll be willing to relinquish those gains easily.
The article quotes U.S. official Pete Hegseth,
Okay.
who says it's unrealistic to expect Ukraine to return to its pre-2014 borders.
Mm-hmm.
He seems to be suggesting that some level of territorial concession is inevitable.
Right, and that view clashes directly with Sir Keir's assertion that Ukraine is on an irreversible path toward joining NATO.
So you've got the U.S. seemingly acknowledging the reality on the ground,
Yeah.
while the U.K. is holding on to this ideal of a fully restored and NATO-protected Ukraine.
Right.
Where does that leave Europe in all of this?
In a very difficult position.
Yeah.
They're caught between these competing visions of a post-conflict settlement, and they have to weigh the risks and rewards of aligning themselves with one side or the other.
And let's not forget the domestic political pressures.
Oh, yeah.
Within each European country,
Absolutely.
public opinion is divided on the issue of military intervention.
It is.
And any leader who commits troops to Ukraine will face intense scrutiny and potential backlash.
For sure. And those political considerations will inevitably shape their negotiating positions.
Yeah.
It's not just about strategic calculations, it's also about domestic politics and public perception.
So it sounds like even if this U.S. backstop comes together, it might not be enough to bridge the gap between these conflicting positions.
That's right. The backstop is just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Yeah.
It might provide some level of reassurance and support, but it can't resolve the fundamental disagreements over Ukraine's future.
Right.
And the extent of Russia's territorial ambitions.
And even if a peace deal is reached, what are the chances of it actually holding?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Any agreement will require a level of trust and goodwill that is currently lacking between the parties involved.
Right.
And let's be realistic. Russia has a history of violating agreements.
Yeah.
And using military force to achieve its objectives.
The article briefly mentions Lord Dannett's estimation that a force of around 100,000 troops would be needed to effectively police the Ukrainian-Russian border.
Yeah.
That's a massive undertaking.
It is.
And it raises all sorts of questions about long-term commitment and sustainability.
Exactly. Even if such a force were assembled, would it be able to deter Russia in the long run?
Right.
Or would it simply become a permanent fixture, a constant reminder of the tensions and divisions that led to this conflict in the first place?
So we're back to that fundamental question. What does a lasting peace actually look like in this scenario?
Right.
And how can we ensure that any agreement reached doesn't simply sow the seeds for future conflict?
Those are the questions that will define the coming months and years.
Yeah.
And while the U.S. backstop might offer a glimmer of hope, it's clear that the path to peace in Ukraine remains fraught with obstacles.
All right, so we've covered the potential layers of the U.S. backstop.
Right.
And the complexities of reaching a peace deal. But what about the broader implications? How does all of this impact Europe's role in the world and its relationship with the U.S.? We'll delve into that in the final part of our deep dive. So we've talked about all these troop numbers and backstops and potential concessions.
Yeah.
But I kind of want to zoom out a bit.
Okay.
And think about the bigger picture here.
Sure.
What does this whole situation tell us about Europe's position on the world stage and its relationship with the U.S.?
Well, this conflict has really thrown a spotlight on the evolving dynamics of transatlantic relations.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you've got the U.S. signaling a potential shift in its security commitments, urging Europe to take more responsibility for its own defense. But on the other hand, the idea of a U.S. backstop suggests that the U.S. isn't completely abandoning Europe.
Yeah.
It's just kind of redefining its role a bit.
It's almost like the U.S. is trying to nudge Europe out of its comfort zone.
Right. Force it to confront the realities of a more multipolar world where threats can emerge from unexpected places.
Yeah.
And traditional alliances might not be enough anymore. And this shift is forcing some hard questions in European capitals.
Yeah.
Can Europe realistically build a military force capable of deterring a power like Russia without significant U.S. involvement?
That's a big question.
It is. And are European nations willing to make the necessary political and financial sacrifices to achieve that level of military autonomy?
The article even quotes Sir Keir saying that while the U.S. might not be leaving NATO, it's time for Europe to grow up and take more responsibility for its own security.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark statement.
It is.
And it speaks volumes about the potential for a more assertive and independent European security posture in the future.
I mean, that statement really gets to the heart of the matter.
It does.
This situation is accelerating a debate that's been simmering for years within NATO.
Yeah.
The debate over burden sharing and the future of the alliance itself, it feels like we're at a crossroads here.
We are.
Will Europe rise to the challenge and embrace a more autonomous security role? Or will it remain reliant on the U.S. security umbrella?
That's the question.
And how will this dynamic play out in other areas of cooperation, like trade, diplomacy, climate change?
These are questions with far-reaching consequences.
Yeah.
And the answers are far from clear.
For sure.
But one thing is certain.
What's that?
This conflict is reshaping the geopolitical landscape.
Yeah.
And the ripple effects will be felt far beyond the borders of Ukraine.
It's also interesting to consider how this entire situation is being perceived by other global players.
Right.
Like China, for instance. They're watching all of this very closely.
They are. How do you think they're interpreting these developments?
Well, from China's perspective, this conflict presents both opportunities and challenges.
Okay.
They see the divisions within NATO.
The potential weakening of Western alliances.
Right.
And they might be tempted to exploit those weaknesses to advance their own interests.
But at the same time, they're also witnessing the resolve of the West in supporting Ukraine.
That's true.
And the crippling sanctions that have been imposed on Russia.
Yeah.
That might give them pause, knowing that similar action would be taken against them if they were to engage in similar aggression.
Exactly. It's a complex calculus for China.
Yeah.
And they're likely playing a long game.
Right.
Observing how this situation unfolds and adjusting their strategy accordingly.
So we've got this tangled web of geopolitical implications, a shifting balance of power, and a whole lot of uncertainty about the future.
A lot of uncertainty.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
And it makes you wonder, how does all of this impact the average person? I mean, these high-level discussions about troop deployments and security guarantees, they might seem distant, but they have very real consequences for all of us.
Absolutely. These geopolitical shifts have the potential to impact our daily lives in profound ways.
In what ways?
Well, think about economic instability, energy prices, the threat of cyber attacks, even the erosion of democratic values.
Right.
These are all issues that are directly connected to the broader geopolitical landscape.
And let's not forget the human cost of this conflict.
Of course.
While we're debating troop numbers and backstops.
Yeah.
People in Ukraine are dying, families are being torn apart.
It's a tragedy.
And the country is facing a humanitarian crisis.
It's a sobering reminder that these aren't just abstract policy debates.
Right.
They have real human consequences.
Yeah.
And as we consider the various scenarios and potential outcomes, we must never lose sight of that fundamental truth.
So where do we go from here? What can the average person do to make sense of this complex and ever-changing world?
I think the most important thing is to stay informed.
Okay.
To engage in critical thinking. And to challenge assumptions.
Right.
Don't just accept what you hear from politicians or the media at face value. Dig deeper, explore different perspectives, and form your own conclusion.
And remember that this is an ongoing story.
It is.
Of constantly evolving narratives.
Yes. What seems clear today might be completely different tomorrow.
That's true.
So stay curious, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions.
Well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this thought.
Okay.
The decisions made in the coming months and years, both by world leaders and ordinary citizens, will shape the future of Europe,
absolutely,
the global balance of power, and ultimately our collective security.
That's true.
So let's try to make those decisions wisely.
I agree.
To our listeners out there, we hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights and a better understanding of the complexities at play in this critical moment in history.
Absolutely.